I'm Rachelle Chase, and I've written two books on Buxton, Iowa. The first one in 2017 is Lost Buxton, and then in 2019 I wrote Creating the Black Utopia of Buxton, Iowa. Buxton was a coal mining town that was established in 1900 by the Consolidation Coal Company, which was owned by the Chicago Northwestern Railroad. The population was about 5,000 people, of which the predominant race was African American, and they were treated equal. It was integrated. There was no segregation. Blacks and whites were treated equally. They were paid equally. Black Americans were doctors and lawyers and dentists and pharmacists and justices of the peace, and they were leaders in the community. So it was a really phenomenal town. There were some African Americans that just about everybody in Buxton knew, regardless of race. There was Hobe Armstrong. He was one of the wealthiest men in southern Iowa. He owned about 1,600 acres of farmland that he would rent out to different people. You had Dr. E.A. Carter, who was the first African American to graduate from the University of Iowa in 1907. There was Lottie Armstrong. She was pretty high up in the bank. She actually was on the board of directors. She was a VP. So this would have been pretty phenomenal for a woman at that time, let alone an African American woman at that time. So the schools in Buxton were integrated as well. You had black and white children going to the same schools, and they were taught by black and white teachers. There were 3 elementary schools in Buxton. You had about 650, 700 students. So there were a lot of children in Buxton. So the churches in Buxton, at one time, they had over 8 African American churches. So this was one area in Buxton where things were segregated, but people pretty much said it was by choice because, people were used to going to their own churches. Churches were a big part of life in there in Buxton. Just like today, churches offered a lot of entertainment and a lot of social activity. There was a very thriving social community for women there in Buxton. On Mondays, the women would dress in their finest clothes and they would parade from one end of town to the other. There were also women's organizations. For Black women, there were more than 40 social organizations. These were organizations that not only social organizations, but they were times for women to get together to figure out how they're going to help the community. Race was very important there, race news, furthering the conditions of African Americans elsewhere. Women were very active in raising funds, in being part of national organizations. Madam C.J. Walker came to Buxton as well and spoke there. It had a very thriving community for women. According to residents, there was not any racial violence there in Buxton. What's interesting, though, is you had literally in the farming community surrounding Buxton, you had Klan activity. You had several residents talked about the fact that they saw cross burnings going on, in the surrounding communities. Iowa was a state that had sundown towns where Blacks could not be there after dark. So again, Buxton was kind of it felt like this oasis in a way in the middle of this state that was not necessarily welcoming to African Americans. I think we can learn a lot from Buxton, though, when you look at, the things that we are talking about today. Buxton, in essence, was incorporating some of these things that we are talking about doing today, giving people equal access to the same opportunities. If you wanted to start your own business, you could go to the bank and get a loan regardless of color. There were more than 40 independent businesses there. Of course, there's no such thing as a utopia. But when you look at what was happening, what life was like for African Americans at that time, when you look at the fact that you had Jim Crow, laws, you had segregation, you had extreme racism and violence against Black Americans. You had lynchings. You had the Klan. You had all of this going on in the country. When you look at that and you look at the people that came to Buxton and the fact that, they didn't experience that. You had the equal access to opportunities. You could start your own business. You could live wherever you wanted. You could, get a loan at the bank. You could do all of these things. So when you look at that and you compare it to what was going on in the country at that time, it does feel like a utopia of sorts.